The alarm tore through the east wing of the academy. Before I even understood what was happening, red light, screeching sound, doors sealing themselves shut along the corridor. I remember freezing, the way most of us do when a klaxon goes off without warning, my 4 eyes locking onto the nearest exit sign, my breathing spikes hitting a level that would embarrass me later. And then I saw her. Grace Sutton was already moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. Not running, not panicking, walking, fast and low, counting exits with her eyes the way the rest of us count breaths. She grabbed the arm of a Velthari student twice her size who had frozen solid with fear, and pulled him toward the stairwell without a single wasted motion. By the time the rest of us understood what floor the fire was on, she already had 6 students moving in the right direction. It turned out to be a drill, a routine one, scheduled weeks in advance, the kind every first-year cadet is warned about during orientation. Nothing was actually burning. No one was in danger. And yet Grace Sutton had reacted like her life depended on it, a full 2 seconds before most of us had processed the sound. I am Alira Voss, and at the time I was in my 2nd year at the Continuum Academy, one of the oldest and most respected teaching institutions in the settled galaxy. Species from 11 systems studied there. We had Velthari with their armored hides, Doskari with their echo senses, Varu with their 4 hearts built for the crushing gravity of their home moons. And we had humans, quiet, soft, forgettable humans, who filled out the lower half of most physical rankings, and the upper half of almost nothing, except mathematics and stubbornness. Grace did not fit that pattern, not even a little. She was assigned to my study group during the 2nd week of term, a small human woman with light brown hair, pulled back in a simple knot, calm eyes, and a habit of apologizing for things that needed no apology. She said sorry when she answered a question too quickly. She said sorry when she reached the end of a corridor before anyone else. She said sorry so often that our group leader, a Doskari student named Ren Aulis, finally asked her to stop. She stopped, immediately, like flipping a switch. That should have told me something right there. At first, I assumed she was simply gifted. The galaxy has plenty of gifted individuals, students who arrive already ahead of their coursework, already comfortable with material that terrifies the rest of us. Humans were known for exactly one thing in academic circles, an unusual talent for pattern recognition and endurance testing, useful in long-form research but rarely dramatic. Grace was not dramatic. She sat at the back of every lecture hall, took notes by hand instead of using a data slate like everyone else, and never volunteered an answer unless called upon directly. When she was called upon, her answers were short, precise, and always correct. It was in our 2nd month together that I noticed the first real inconsistency. We were studying environmental science, specifically a unit on hostile planetary conditions, the kind of material meant to prepare cadets for eventual postings on frontier worlds. Our instructor, a broad-shouldered Baru named Instructor Vesic, displayed an image of a planet with violent storm systems, a thick toxic atmosphere, and gravity nearly double standard. He asked the class to estimate survival time for an unprotected humanoid. Most students guessed minutes, a few guessed seconds. One overly confident Velthari cadet guessed an hour, based on his species' naturally thick skin. Grace raised her hand without being asked, which she never did, and gave an answer that made the entire room go quiet. She said a trained and adapted person could survive there indefinitely, provided they understood the storm cycles and knew where to find shelter before each one arrived. Instructor Vesic laughed, not unkindly, and told her that was an interesting piece of fiction. Grace did not laugh back. She simply nodded, wrote something in her notebook, and said nothing else for the rest of the lecture. I asked her about it afterward, walking beside her through the courtyard where the artificial sky was shifting into its scheduled evening color. I asked if she had been joking. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me feel like she was deciding how much to say. Then she said, quite simply, that where she grew up, storms like that were considered mild. I thought she was exaggerating. Humans do that sometimes, we had been taught, a cultural habit of dramatizing ordinary things for effect. I laughed, and told her that was a very human thing to say. She smiled, a small tired smile, and changed the subject to our upcoming assignment. It did not occur to me at the time that she had not actually been joking at all. The second incident happened during a chemistry laboratory session, 3 weeks later. We were working with a set of compounds known for their instability when improperly mixed, a standard exercise meant to teach caution and procedure. A Doskari student named Tavin Rise, normally careful, misread a measurement and combined two reagents that should never have touched. The reaction was small, contained within the safety hood, over in under 2 seconds, releasing a cloud of sharp-smelling vapor and a puff of orange smoke. No one was hurt. But the room erupted into chaos anyway, alarms blaring, students shoving toward the exits, the safety systems flooding the space with counteragent mist. Grace did not move toward the exit. She stepped toward the hood, sniffed the air once, and told the lab assistant exactly which compound had been produced, and that it would be safe to breathe within 11 seconds. She was right, almost to the second. When the lab assistant asked how she knew, Grace said she had grown up around chemical smells that could kill a person in under a minute, so she had learned early to recognize the difference between dangerous and merely unpleasant. The lab assistant, a young Velthari graduate named Corin Halden, wrote up an incident report that evening. I know this because I saw a copy of it weeks later, buried in an academic file I probably should not have been looking through. That night I could not stop thinking about her. I pulled up her student record on the Academy database, using access privileges granted to senior study group leaders, technically permitted but rarely used out of simple curiosity. Her academic scores were unremarkable in most categories, solid, but not exceptional, exactly what you would expect from an average human cadet. But her planetary origin listing caught my attention immediately. Most habitable worlds carry a simple classification code, a letter and number combination indicating gravity, atmosphere composition, and general environmental stability. I had seen dozens of these codes during my studies. Grace's listing carried a symbol I did not recognize at all, a small triangular mark next to her planet's name that I had never once seen attached to an inhabited, unquarantined world. I asked one of my professors about it the next day, phrasing the question carefully so it would not seem like I was asking about a specific student. He told me the symbol indicated a world with what the Academy classified as elevated background hazard levels, a category normally reserved for planets used for military survival training, not for raising children. I remember sitting with that information for a long time, turning it over, trying to make it fit with the quiet, apologetic young woman who sat in the back of our lectures taking notes by hand. It did not fit, not yet. Over the following weeks I started paying closer attention, the way you do once your curiosity has been properly sparked. I noticed things I had dismissed before as simple personality quirks. Grace never complained about the Academy's artificial gravity settings, even when they were adjusted for species far heavier than humans, conditions that left half our human classmates dizzy and nauseated for hours. She ate the cafeteria food without hesitation, including dishes that had sent multiple students to the medical wing due to unfamiliar allergens, and never once got sick. She slept through nighttime maintenance alarms that woke the rest of the dormitory, yet startled awake instantly, fully alert, the moment an actual anomaly was detected in the building's systems. She was strong in ways that did not show on the surface. During a mandatory fitness evaluation, most human cadets performed near the bottom of the rankings, a well-known and accepted fact across the Academy. Grace performed near the middle, unremarkable by any objective measure, until the evaluators added an endurance component, a sustained exercise designed to run cadets past exhaustion to measure recovery time. She did not stop. Long after the other human cadets had collapsed, long after several stronger species had tapped out entirely, Grace kept going, calm and steady, her breathing controlled, her expression almost bored. The evaluators eventually had to end the test themselves, unsure how long she would have continued if left alone. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing sense of unease, that Grace Sutton was not simply gifted. She was calibrated for something none of us had ever experienced, something that made everything the Academy considered dangerous feel, to her, like an ordinary afternoon. I tried asking her directly, one evening in the study hall, the two of us alone at a table surrounded by half-finished coursework. I asked her, plainly, what her homeworld was actually like. She was quiet for a moment, turning her stylus over in her fingers, the way she did when deciding how much truth a conversation could hold. Then she told me, in a calm and steady voice, that her planet had a name most people outside her home system had never heard, and that the galaxy generally avoided it, for good reason. She said the weather there did not simply rain or snow, it hunted. I laughed, assuming she meant it as a figure of speech, a colorful way of describing bad storms. She did not laugh with me. She simply looked at me with those calm, tired eyes, and said she was not exaggerating even slightly, and that where she came from, the weather was one of the smaller problems. I asked what the bigger problems were. She smiled, the same small, tired smile from before, and told me that was a conversation for another day, because it was getting late and she still had an assignment to finish. I let it go, that night. I told myself I had misunderstood her, that the language barrier between our cultures had exaggerated something ordinary into something frightening. Humans were known for storytelling, after all, a species that turned even simple things into dramatic tales. I did not yet understand that Grace Sutton was not telling stories at all. She was simply describing her childhood. There was a particular moment, a few days after that conversation, that I have never quite been able to shake from my memory. We were walking back from a late evening lecture on comparative biology, cutting through the Academy's central garden, a quiet space filled with carefully maintained plant life from a dozen different worlds, chosen specifically for their calm, harmless beauty. A sudden gust of artificial wind moved through the garden, part of the scheduled climate cycle, nothing unusual at all. Every other student around us barely reacted, continuing their conversations without pause. Grace, however, stopped walking entirely for a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning the tree line above us, her weight shifting subtly onto the balls of her feet. It lasted less than 2 seconds. She caught herself almost immediately, relaxed her posture, and continued walking, as if nothing had happened at all. I do not think she even realized I had noticed. I asked her gently what had caused her to react that way. She seemed almost embarrassed, admitting that certain wind patterns back home carried warnings most people never had to think twice about, and that old habits, apparently, did not disappear simply because the danger they were built for was no longer present. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her that reflexes built for one world rarely made sense on another. She smiled faintly, agreed politely, and changed the subject. But I noticed, over the following days, that it kept happening. Small moments. A sudden shift in temperature that made her glance instinctively toward the nearest exit. A loud noise from a maintenance drone that had her half turned before she consciously stopped herself. None of it was dramatic. None of it drew attention from anyone but me, and only because I had already begun watching more closely than I should have. But taken together, those small moments painted a picture I could not ignore. Grace was not simply calm under pressure. She was built for a world that never stopped testing her, and some part of her, even here, surrounded by artificial safety and carefully engineered comfort, had never fully believed the danger was gone. It would take a real crisis, weeks later, out beyond the safety of the Academy's walls, for the rest of us to finally understand exactly what that meant. But even before that day arrived, something inside me had already started to shift, a growing awareness that the quiet, apologetic human, sitting at the back of our lectures, was not underestimated by accident. She was underestimated because none of us had any idea what a death world actually was. And she had grown up on one. The weeks that followed changed the way I looked at almost everyone around me, not just Grace. Once you notice one impossible thing, you start noticing all the small signs you had trained yourself to ignore. I began watching her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing need to understand something my education had never prepared me for. The Academy ran a mandatory field course during the middle of the term, a joint exercise between the Environmental Science Department and the Survival Training Division. Cadets from every species were paired into small teams and sent through a series of controlled challenges designed to simulate frontier conditions. It was considered a rite of passage, difficult enough to test real limits, but supervised closely enough that no one had ever been seriously hurt. I was paired with Grace, along with a Velthari cadet named Doran Kesh and a Baru cadet named Osa Thren. The four of us were given basic equipment, a set of coordinates, and instructions to reach a marked checkpoint through a stretch of engineered wilderness on the Academy's outer campus, an area filled with artificial terrain hazards, simulated wildlife, and shifting weather patterns designed to keep cadets on edge. Doran was strong and confident, the kind of student who had never once doubted his own physical superiority. Osa was steady and practical, built for endurance in ways few species could match. I considered myself reasonably capable, quick thinking if not physically impressive. And Grace, quiet as always, simply listened to the instructions, checked her equipment twice, and said very little as we set out. The first obstacle was a stretch of unstable ground, engineered to shift and sink unpredictably beneath our feet. Doran charged ahead confidently and sank to his waist within the first few steps, forcing the rest of us to slow down and think more carefully. Grace walked the edge of the unstable zone instead, testing the ground with careful, measured steps, reading the subtle color changes in the soil that the rest of us had completely overlooked. She found a safe path around the hazard in under a minute, then came back to help pull Doran free without being asked. I remember Doran thanking her, slightly embarrassed, and Grace simply shrugging it off, saying that unstable ground was something you learned to read early, or you learned it the hard way, and either way you learned it. The second obstacle was worse, a simulated predator encounter, designed using holographic projections combined with real environmental sensors, meant to trigger genuine stress responses in cadets without any actual danger involved. A pack of projected creatures, modeled loosely after several real frontier predators, emerged from the tree line ahead of us, snarling, circling, testing our formation the way real predators would. Osa froze immediately, every muscle locking in place, a common Baru response to sudden threat displays. Doran drew his training weapon and began shouting, trying to scare the creatures off with noise and aggression, a reasonable Velthari instinct that had absolutely no effect on holographic projections designed to ignore exactly that kind of behavior. Grace did neither. She went completely still, her breathing slowing rather than quickening, her eyes tracking the projected creatures with a focus I had never seen in her before. She did not look afraid. She looked like she was reading a familiar page in a familiar book, patient and unhurried, waiting for something specific. When the lead creature made its projected charge, Grace stepped sideways at exactly the right moment, redirected Doran's arm away from where he was aiming, and pointed calmly toward a gap in the tree line that the rest of us had not even noticed. She told us, in a low and steady voice, that predators like this typically worked in pairs, one to charge and one to flank, and that we needed to move through the gap immediately before the second one arrived. She was right. Seconds later, a second projected creature emerged exactly where she had predicted, from an angle that would have caught us completely unprepared if we had stayed in our original position. The exercise instructors, watching from remote observation posts, later told us that our team had cleared the predator encounter faster than any group that semester, and asked Grace directly how she had anticipated the flanking maneuver so precisely. She told them, in the same calm and matter-of-fact tone she always used, that the behavior pattern was extremely common among pack hunters, and that she had simply reacted the way anyone from her home region would have reacted, without really thinking about it. The instructors exchanged a look I did not understand at the time, wrote something down, and moved us along to the next obstacle without further comment. By the time we reached the final checkpoint, hours later, exhausted and covered in the artificial dust of the engineered terrain, something had shifted in the way Doran and Osa looked at Grace. Not suspicion, not exactly. Something closer to quiet, uncertain respect, mixed with a growing awareness that she had been holding something back the entire time, something none of us had the framework to properly understand yet. That evening, back in the dormitory, I decided to try something different. Instead of asking Grace directly about her homeworld again, a question she had clearly been reluctant to answer in detail, I asked her something smaller instead. I asked her what an ordinary day looked like for her, back when she was a child. She seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had ever framed it quite that way before. She sat down across from me at the small dormitory table, wrapped her hands around a cup of the tasteless synthetic tea the academy provided, and thought for a long moment before answering. She said mornings usually started with checking the weather readings first, before anything else, because certain wind patterns meant certain doors stayed sealed until midday. She said breakfast was whatever had survived the overnight storage checks, because some of the local plant life produced compounds that turned toxic if left exposed too long. She said school, when it happened at all, was often interrupted by seismic warnings, because the ground beneath her settlement was known to shift without much notice. She said all of this in the same flat, ordinary tone someone else might use to describe checking a weather app or eating breakfast cereal. I asked her, carefully, how her settlement dealt with all of that. She told me most settlements did not deal with it well, and that a fairly high number of people did not survive to adulthood, especially in the early years, before certain safety measures were properly established. She said her own family had lost people more than once, and that this was simply understood as part of life, not something anyone dwelled on excessively. I asked her why anyone would choose to live somewhere like that in the first place. She told me nobody chose it, not really. Her ancestors had been sent there generations ago, part of an early colonization effort that had drastically underestimated the planet's true hazard level before proper survey technology existed. By the time later generations understood exactly how dangerous their new home truly was, leaving was no longer a simple option, and so the population had done the only thing left available to them. They adapted. She said this last part with a small note of quiet pride in her voice. The first time I had heard anything resembling pride from her in the entire time I had known her. She said her people had built an entire way of life around surviving conditions that would have wiped out most other species within a single generation, and that over time, surviving had simply become normal. I asked her if she considered her homeworld dangerous. She paused for a long moment before answering, turning her cup slowly in her hands. Then she told me that dangerous was a strange word to use for the only place she had ever called home, because to her, it was simply the world, the way it had always been, the way it had always worked. She said the real danger, as far as she was concerned, was forgetting the rules, even for a moment, because her homeworld did not offer second chances to people who forgot. I remember sitting with that answer for a long time after she went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my own dormitory room, trying and failing to imagine a childhood built around rules like that. The next morning, during a routine review of survival exercise records, I overheard two instructors discussing something in the observation office, a conversation I was probably not meant to hear. One of them mentioned Grace's name, followed by a reference to a classification review that had apparently been quietly opened following the predator encounter exercise. The other instructor asked what the review had found. The first instructor said something that stayed with me for a very long time afterward. She said the survival simulation's threat parameters, the ones used to challenge and test even the most capable cadets at the academy, had been calibrated using outdated hazard data that significantly underestimated conditions on certain known death worlds. She said, in other words, that the simulation meant to push Grace to her absolute limits had actually been easier, by a significant margin, than an average day on Grace's actual homeworld. I did not fully understand the weight of that statement at the time. I understood it as an interesting piece of academic trivia, a small correction to be filed away in some administrative record somewhere. There was one more detail from that field course I have never quite forgotten, something small that I only understood fully much later. Toward the end of our exercise, while we waited at the final checkpoint for transport back to the main campus, Osa asked Grace directly whether she had ever been truly afraid, the way the rest of us had been during the predator encounter. Grace considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, and told Osa that fear was not something her homeworld had ever allowed her the luxury of avoiding entirely. She said she still felt it, every time, a tight, cold pressure somewhere behind her ribs whenever real danger appeared. The difference, she explained, was that her people had learned, out of necessity, to keep moving through that feeling, rather than letting it take control, because on her homeworld, freezing in place for even a few seconds was often the difference between walking away and not walking away at all. She said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for the weight of what she had actually said to settle over the rest of us. Doran, normally quick with a joke or a boastful comment, said nothing at all for the rest of the walk back to the transport. I thought about that conversation often in the days that followed, turning it over in my mind during lectures, during meals, during the quiet hours before sleep. It changed the way I understood courage itself. I had always assumed bravery meant the absence of fear, some special quality certain individuals simply possessed and others did not. Grace's quiet explanation suggested something entirely different, a kind of courage, built not from fearlessness, but from sheer, repeated practice, forged through a childhood that had never once given her the option of falling apart. It would not be until the crisis several weeks later, out beyond the safety of controlled simulations and engineered terrain, that I finally understood exactly what that quiet conversation had meant, and exactly what kind of person had been sitting quietly at the back of our lectures the entire time, apologizing for reaching the exit first. The Class 4 hostile world simulation was the single most feared exercise in the entire Academy curriculum, a mandatory evaluation every student had to pass before advancing into their third year. Unlike the smaller field exercises we had already completed, this was run inside the Academy's largest immersive training dome, a fully enclosed environment capable of simulating extreme planetary conditions with terrifying accuracy. Gravity could be adjusted. Atmosphere composition could be altered within safety limits. Temperature, wind, terrain, and simulated wildlife could all be combined into a single continuous scenario lasting several hours, without pause, without mercy. Every student dreaded it. Stories circulated every year about cadets who broke down partway through, about strong Velthari warriors reduced to shaking wrecks, about confident Doskari students freezing completely under the weight of simulated danger that felt, by every physical measure available to the senses, completely real. I remember standing in the preparation hall the morning of the exercise, surrounded by nervous classmates checking their equipment for the third and fourth time, the air thick with anxious energy from a dozen different species. Doran paced back and forth, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Asa sat perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing in slow, deliberate patterns meant to calm a racing heart. Grace stood near the equipment rack, checking her gear once, calmly, the way she checked everything, and then simply waited. I asked her if she was nervous. She looked at me, considered the question seriously the way she considered most things, and told me she was not particularly nervous, though she understood why the rest of us were. I asked her why she felt that way. She said the simulation, from everything she had read in the briefing materials, sounded fairly standard. I did not understand what she meant by standard until several hours later. The simulation began with a shuttle failure scenario, a common and well-tested starting point for Class 4 exercises. Our group, 12 cadets in total including Grace, Doran, Osa, and myself, were told our transport had crash-landed on an unnamed hostile world, following a navigation malfunction. Our objective was simple in description and brutal in execution. Reach a designated extraction point roughly 40 kilometers away within a set time limit, while surviving whatever the simulated environment decided to throw at us along the way. The dome's systems activated fully the moment the scenario began, and the transformation was immediate and disorienting. Gravity increased by nearly 40%, a change that hit every non-adapted species hard within the first few steps. The simulated sky darkened into a strange greenish color, thick with artificial cloud cover, designed to reduce visibility and disorient normal navigation instincts. Wind began howling across the terrain almost immediately, carrying with it a fine, gritty simulated dust that stung exposed skin and clouded protective visors. Doran staggered under the sudden gravity shift, nearly falling before catching himself against a jagged outcropping of simulated rock. Asa moved slower than usual, her normally steady breathing turning labored within the first 10 minutes. Several other cadets in our group began showing clear signs of distress almost immediately, faces pale, movements stiff and uncertain. Grace adjusted her stance slightly, rolled her shoulders once as if settling into a familiar weight, and kept walking at exactly the same pace she had started with. I asked her, breathless myself under the increased gravity, how she was managing so easily. She told me the gravity here was actually lighter than what she had grown up with, and that the adjustment felt almost pleasant by comparison, like carrying a lighter pack than usual. The first real threat appeared roughly 90 minutes into the exercise, a simulated predator pack far larger and more aggressive than anything we had encountered during the smaller field course weeks earlier. These creatures were faster, more coordinated, clearly designed to overwhelm groups that failed to maintain proper formation and awareness. Several cadets from a neighboring team, visible in the distance across the simulated terrain, were forced into an emergency extraction after their formation broke apart under the pressure. Our own group held together, though barely, largely because Grace refused to let the panic spread. When the first creatures emerged from the artificial tree line, snarling and circling with unsettling precision, she immediately took position at the rear of our formation, the traditional flanking point, and began calling out clear, calm instructions that cut through the rising fear in everyone else's voice. She told Doran to stop shouting, because the noise was drawing more attention rather than less. She told Osa to keep moving steadily rather than freezing. because sudden stillness after movement often triggered predatory instincts rather than suppressing them. She positioned the smaller, more vulnerable cadets toward the center of our group and kept herself constantly between us and the largest visible threat. When the predators made their coordinated charge, exactly the kind of flanking maneuver she had predicted weeks earlier, Grace was already moving to intercept the angle, before the rest of us had even processed what was happening. She did not fight the creatures directly, that was never the objective of the exercise, but she guided our formation through the gap in their coordinated attack, with a precision that left the observing instructors, watching from remote monitoring stations, visibly startled according to reports I heard afterward. We lost no members of our group during that encounter. Several neighboring teams were not so fortunate, their simulations ending early due to critical failure conditions. The environment continued deteriorating as the hours passed. A simulated storm system rolled across the terrain roughly 3 hours into the exercise, exactly the kind of violent, building-destroying weather Grace had once described to me during our quiet conversation in the study hall. Lightning split the artificial sky in jagged, brilliant bursts. Wind speeds climbed high enough that several cadets were forced to anchor themselves against rock formations simply to avoid being knocked off their feet. Most of our group huddled together, seeking whatever shelter the terrain offered, faces tight with genuine fear despite knowing, intellectually, that the danger was simulated. Grace stood slightly apart, watching the storm's movement across the horizon, with a focused, calculating expression, tracking something the rest of us could not identify. She told us, with total confidence, that the storm's core would pass roughly 2 kilometers to our north within the next 20 minutes, and that if we moved southeast immediately, we could avoid the worst of the wind shear entirely, while still making progress toward our extraction point. Doran, exhausted and frightened, asked her how she could possibly know that with such certainty. Grace pointed toward a specific pattern in the simulated cloud formation, a subtle rotation most of us had not even noticed, and explained that storms behaved according to consistent, learnable patterns, provided someone had spent enough time learning to read them. We followed her guidance. The storm's core passed almost exactly where she predicted, missing our position by a wide enough margin that we experienced only moderate wind and rain, rather than the full, simulation-ending violence that struck the northern sector of the training terrain, where 2 other cadet teams were forced into emergency extraction. By the time we finally reached the designated extraction point, nearly 5 hours after the exercise began, our group was exhausted, bruised, and thoroughly rattled, every member except one. Grace looked tired, certainly, the physical exertion having taken some visible toll even on her, but there was no trace of the shaken, hollowed-out expression worn by every other cadet who reached extraction that day. She looked, more than anything else, like someone who had just finished an unusually long, but entirely ordinary hike. The instructors gathered our group for a brief debriefing before releasing us to medical evaluation, standard procedure following any Class 4 exercise. One of them, an older Baru instructor named Instructor Threll, pulled Grace aside separately, speaking to her in a low voice I was standing just close enough to overhear. He asked her, with clear and genuine curiosity, how she had managed to remain so calm throughout an exercise specifically designed to push cadets past their breaking point. Grace answered honestly, the way she always did. She told him the simulation had been challenging, certainly more demanding than the smaller field exercises, but that it had never once felt like a genuine threat to her life. Not in the way her instincts recognized real danger. She said everything the simulation had presented, the gravity, the predators, the storm, followed patterns she had learned to read before she was old enough to attend proper schooling. Instructor Threll asked her, carefully, what her homeworld's conditions were typically like, compared to what she had just experienced. Grace considered the question for a long moment, the same careful consideration she gave every serious question. Then she told him that the simulation, from her perspective, had been noticeably gentler than an average day back home, mostly because it lacked several hazards her people considered basic and unavoidable, hazards the simulation's programming apparently did not even account for. I watched Instructor Threll's expression shift as she spoke, moving from professional curiosity into something closer to quiet, dawning concern. Later that evening, exhausted and sore from the day's exercise, I overheard a conversation between 2 instructors in the observation office, much like the one I had overheard weeks earlier following the predator encounter during our smaller field course. This time, the conversation was longer, more detailed, and considerably more serious in tone. One instructor mentioned that the Academy's Class 4 simulation parameters, the ones responsible for testing the absolute limits of every cadet who passed through the program, had been formally reviewed following Grace's file being flagged during the earlier field exercise. The review, apparently, had confirmed something deeply unsettling. The simulation, designed to represent among the most extreme survivable conditions the Academy could safely reproduce, was significantly milder than the actual, average, documented conditions on Grace's homeworld, a planet officially classified using hazard symbols the Academy had never before applied to an inhabited, populated world. The other instructor asked, quietly, how humanity had managed to survive there long enough to establish a stable population at all. I did not hear a clear answer to that question that night. I would not fully understand it myself until weeks later, when a very real crisis, far beyond the safety of any controlled simulation, finally forced the truth into the open for every single one of us to witness firsthand. During our medical evaluation following the simulation, a routine procedure meant to check for stress-related injuries and dehydration, I overheard the examining physician quietly remark to her assistant that Grace's vital signs throughout the entire 5-hour exercise had barely deviated from her normal resting baseline, a pattern the physician described as almost unheard of among cadets who had just completed a Class 4 evaluation. Most students, regardless of species, showed significant stress markers for hours afterward: elevated heart rates, disrupted breathing patterns, lingering muscle tension that sometimes took a full day to fully resolve. Grace showed almost none of it. Her body, it seemed, simply did not register the exercise as a genuine crisis, no matter how convincingly the simulation had been designed to feel like one. I mentioned this to her later that evening, as we sat together in the dormitory common room, both of us still recovering from the day's exertion. She was not surprised by what the physician had noted. She told me her body had simply learned, long before she ever arrived at the Academy, to reserve real physiological stress responses for situations that actually threatened to end badly. Anything less than that, no matter how convincing the simulation, her body apparently filed away as manageable, routine, survivable. I asked her how that kind of internal calibration was even possible, whether it was something she had consciously trained, or something built into her simply through years of repeated exposure. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering, telling me she honestly was not certain herself, that the line between conscious training and simple necessity had blurred somewhere in her early childhood, long before she was old enough to separate the two. It was a strange thing, sitting there listening to her describe her own resilience, with such quiet, unassuming honesty, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, rather than something the Academy's most experienced instructors were still struggling to fully understand. Until that day, I simply carried the same growing, unsettled thought that had been building in me since the very first alarm I heard sound through the East Wing corridor. We had been calling Grace Sutton a student. We had no real idea what she actually was. The field trip to Kesserin Moon was supposed to be simple, a reward for third-year cadets who had passed their Class 4 evaluations, a short orbital hop to observe a moderately hospitable moon, known mostly for its unusual mineral formations and mild, predictable weather. It was the kind of excursion the Academy considered safe enough for recreational credit, staffed by 2 instructors and equipped with standard, non-emergency gear. 22 cadets boarded the transport shuttle that morning, myself and Grace among them, along with Doran, Asa, and a mix of students from several other species. The mood was relaxed, almost festive, the first genuinely low-pressure outing any of us had experienced since the Class 4 exercise weeks earlier. The shuttle's descent began normally. I remember looking out through the small viewport beside my seat, watching the moon's pale gray surface grow larger beneath thin streaks of cloud, thinking about nothing more serious than which mineral samples I wanted to collect first. Then the ship shuddered, hard, throwing several unsecured items across the cabin. The pilot's voice came over the intercom moments later, tight and controlled but unmistakably urgent, explaining that we had struck an unexpected debris field, remnants of an old, poorly charted mining operation that should have been cleared from our approach vector but apparently was not. 2 of our secondary thrusters had been damaged. We were losing altitude faster than planned, and an emergency landing, rather than our scheduled docking approach, was now unavoidable. The next several minutes blurred together in a way I still struggle to fully describe. Alarms blaring, the cabin shaking violently, instructors shouting instructions that most of us barely processed through the fear. When the shuttle finally came to a hard, scraping stop across the moon's uneven surface, the cabin lights flickered once, then failed entirely, leaving us in the dim glow of emergency lighting alone. We had crash-landed roughly 60 kilometers from our intended destination, in a region of Kesserin Moon that had never been properly surveyed for cadet excursions. The first instructor, a Doskari named Instructor Sella, was badly injured during the impact, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that left the rest of us badly shaken. The second instructor, a younger Velthari, named Instructor Farn, had a fractured leg and could barely stand without significant pain. Our communication systems, meant to alert Academy rescue teams automatically, had been damaged in the impact and were transmitting nothing but static. Panic spread through the cabin almost immediately. Several cadets began shouting over each other, some crying, some simply frozen in place, staring blankly at the wreckage around them. Doran tried to take charge, his voice cracking with barely controlled fear, but nobody seemed capable of listening clearly enough to follow him. Grace moved through the chaos differently than everyone else, the same calm, purposeful movement I had seen from her during every previous incident, except this time there was a weight behind her actions that had never been there before, an intensity that told me, immediately, that she understood exactly how serious our situation truly was. She checked Instructor Sella's injuries first, applying pressure to the head wound with practiced, steady hands, speaking softly and reassuringly the entire time despite the instructor remaining unconscious. She checked Instructor Farn next, stabilizing his fractured leg with materials pulled from the shuttle's emergency kit, moving with a speed and precision that made it clear she had done this kind of thing before, many times, under conditions far worse than a controlled crash site. Then she turned to the rest of us, her voice cutting through the panic, with a calm authority none of us had ever heard from her before. She told us, plainly, that Kesserin Moon's atmosphere, while generally stable, experienced dangerous compositional shifts during specific seasonal windows, shifts the Academy's excursion briefing had apparently failed to properly account for, given how far off course we had crashed. She said our current location, based on the terrain and mineral deposits visible outside the shuttle, was almost certainly inside one of those hazardous zones, and that the atmosphere around us would likely become unbreathable within a matter of hours as the seasonal shift progressed. I remember the cabin going completely silent as she spoke, every cadet finally listening, finally understanding that this was no longer a simple matter of waiting quietly for rescue. Grace explained that our best chance of survival was reaching higher elevation, where the dangerous atmospheric compounds were known to disperse more quickly, and that we needed to move immediately, carrying both injured instructors with us, before the shift progressed any further. Doran asked how she possibly knew any of this, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Grace did not have time for a lengthy explanation. She simply told him that she had read about similar atmospheric patterns during her environmental science coursework, and that the terrain features around us matched the warning signs closely enough that she was not willing to take the risk of waiting to find out for certain. I found out much later that this was only partially true. She had recognized the danger not primarily from her coursework, but from instincts built through an entire childhood spent reading exactly these kinds of subtle environmental warning signs, instincts so deeply ingrained that she barely had to think before acting on them. Under her direction, our group organized quickly, cadets pairing off to carry emergency supplies and support the injured instructors between them. Grace personally carried the majority of Instructor Sella's weight herself, refusing help from cadets she judged too exhausted or too frightened to manage the extra burden safely, moving at a pace that pushed the rest of us hard, but never so hard that anyone was left behind. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed, jagged rock formations and loose, unstable ground slowing our progress considerably. Asa struggled under the combination of Kesserin's gravity and the physical strain of the climb, her breathing growing labored, her steps growing unsteady. Grace noticed immediately, adjusting our pace without drawing attention to the reason, giving Osa small opportunities to recover, without ever making her feel singled out or weak in front of the others. Roughly 2 hours into our climb, exactly as Grace had warned, the air around us began to change. A faint, acrid smell crept into the atmosphere, subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable, causing several cadets to cough and their eyes to water. Panic began rising again, several students quickening their pace instinctively, threatening to break the careful formation Grace had established. She stopped everyone immediately, her voice sharp and commanding in a way that cut cleanly through the rising fear. She told us that panicking now would only cause people to breathe harder, faster, taking in more of the compromised air than necessary, and that we needed to move with controlled, steady breathing, exactly as she had shown us, or risk making our situation considerably worse. Her calm proved contagious in a way that pure instruction never could have. Watching her remain steady, breathing controlled, movements unhurried despite the obvious danger closing in around us, gave the rest of us something solid to hold on to, something to imitate, even through our own fear. We reached higher ground perhaps 20 minutes before the atmospheric compounds would have become genuinely dangerous at our previous position. According to the readings Instructor Farn was able to check once his equipment came back online at the higher elevation. The air grew noticeably cleaner as we climbed further, the acrid smell fading, replaced by the thin, cold, but breathable atmosphere typical of Kesseran's upper elevations. It was there, exhausted, shaken, but alive, that our group finally managed to establish a working emergency signal. Using a backup transmitter Grace had located and repaired herself, using components salvaged from the shuttle's damaged primary system, working with a technical competence that left even Instructor Farn visibly impressed despite his pain. Rescue arrived roughly 3 hours later. A full Academy response team dispatched the moment our emergency signal finally reached orbit. By the time the rescue shuttle touched down near our position, every member of our stranded group was accounted for, injured but stable, exhausted but alive, thanks almost entirely to the quiet, apologetic human who had spent the entire crisis moving through danger with the calm, practiced ease of someone simply going about an ordinary day. I remember sitting beside Grace during the flight back to the Academy, both of us wrapped in emergency thermal blankets, watching Kesseran Moon shrink behind us through the small viewport. I asked her, quietly, how she had managed to stay so calm through the entire ordeal, when every other cadet, myself included, had been fighting back genuine panic the entire time. She was silent for a long moment, staring out at the stars beginning to appear as we climbed back toward orbit. Then she told me something I have carried with me ever since, something that finally made everything I had witnessed over the previous months click into place. She said that back home, situations like this were not considered emergencies at all. They were considered Tuesdays. She said her people did not have the luxury of panicking during moments like this, because panic got people killed just as quickly as the danger itself did, and her homeworld had never once forgiven that kind of mistake. I asked her, gently, if she had ever lost anyone that way, to panic, rather than to the danger itself. She looked at me then, her expression carrying a weight I had never seen from her before, a tired, quiet sadness that told me everything I needed to know before she even answered. She said yes, more than once, and that this was exactly why she had learned so early, so thoroughly, never to let fear control her actions, no matter how dangerous the situation became. I did not ask her anything else after that. I simply sat beside her in silence, watching the stars, finally understanding the true weight behind everything I had witnessed since the very first alarm sounded through the East Wing corridor months earlier. Before the rescue shuttle carried us the rest of the way home, Instructor Farn, still visibly in pain from his fractured leg, pulled Grace aside for a brief conversation I happened to overhear from where I sat nearby. He thanked her, plainly and sincerely, for what she had done, admitting that without her guidance, he doubted our group would have survived long enough for rescue to reach us in time. Grace accepted his thanks with the same quiet humility she showed toward almost everything, telling him she had simply done what anyone from her background would have done in the same situation. Instructor Farn shook his head slightly at that, telling her he had served as an instructor at the Academy for over a decade, and that in all his years of teaching survival principles to cadets from a dozen different species, he had never once seen anyone, student or instructor, handle a genuine crisis with the level of composure she had shown that day. He asked her, carefully, whether the Academy's survival curriculum had ever properly prepared any of its students for real, unscripted danger, the kind with no safety protocols and no emergency shutdown switch waiting in reserve. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. She told him the curriculum taught useful theory, certainly, but that theory alone had never once been enough to guarantee survival where she came from. Theory told you what could happen. Only direct experience, repeated and unforgiving, taught you how to actually survive it when it did. Instructor Farn did not have a response to that. He simply nodded slowly, thanked her once more, and allowed the medical team to help him aboard the rescue shuttle. We had spent an entire term believing Grace Sutton was simply an unusually capable student. We had no idea, until that day, exactly how much she had already survived, long before she ever set foot inside our academy. News of the Kesserin Moon incident spread through the academy quickly, the way important stories always do, though the official reports downplayed most of what had actually happened, focusing instead on the successful rescue, rather than the details of how our group had survived long enough to be rescued at all. Instructor Sella recovered fully within a week, and Instructor Farn returned to teaching with a mild limp and a noticeably different way of looking at Grace whenever she entered a room. I noticed the shift almost immediately among the surviving members of our group. Doran, who had once treated Grace with a kind of casual, unthinking condescension, typical of how most species viewed humans across the galaxy, now greeted her with a quiet, careful respect he clearly struggled to fully articulate. Asa, normally reserved even by Baru standards, made a point of sitting beside Grace during meals, something she had never done before the incident. Grace herself did not seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, the change in how people treated her. She continued attending her lectures, taking notes by hand, answering questions when called upon with the same short, precise answers she had always given. If anything, she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the increased attention, occasionally deflecting compliments with the same quiet, apologetic manner I had noticed the very first week I met her. I found myself wanting to understand more, not out of idle curiosity anymore, but out of a genuine desire to understand the person who had quietly saved every member of our group, without a single moment of hesitation or doubt. Roughly 2 weeks after the Kesserin incident, I finally worked up the courage to ask her the question I had been holding back since our very first real conversation in the study hall. I asked her, plainly, if she would tell me what her homeworld was actually like, the full truth this time, without softening it for my comfort. We were sitting outside, in the academy's central courtyard, watching the artificial sky shift slowly through its programmed evening colors. Grace was quiet for a long time, longer than I expected, turning the question over carefully before finally beginning to speak. She told me her planet's official academy designation meant very little to the people who actually lived there. To them, it was simply home, a name passed down through generations who had never known anything different. She said the atmosphere itself was breathable, technically, but carried trace compounds that required specialized filtering systems in every settlement, systems that had to be maintained constantly, because even a short lapse could prove fatal within hours. She described gravity that shifted unpredictably in certain regions due to unusual deposits deep beneath the surface, strong enough in places to cause serious injury to anyone unfamiliar with the warning signs. She described local wildlife, not simply predators in the traditional sense, but entire ecosystems built around aggression and territorial defense, plants included, some capable of releasing toxins on contact, others camouflaged so effectively that avoiding them required lifelong familiarity most outsiders could never hope to develop quickly enough to survive. She told me about the seasonal storms, the same ones she had mentioned briefly months earlier, storms capable of stripping poorly reinforced structures down to their foundations, storms her people tracked and prepared for, with the same seriousness other cultures reserved for their most sacred traditions. She told me about the migration season, a period each year when several of the planet's largest and most dangerous creatures moved through populated regions in search of resources, a season her people simply referred to as the quiet months, because most outdoor activity ceased entirely until it passed. She spoke about all of this with a strange, steady calm that I had come to recognize as uniquely hers, neither boastful nor self-pitying, simply factual, the way someone might describe the ordinary rhythms of any other life. I asked her, carefully, how her people had managed to survive there long enough to build any kind of lasting settlement at all. She told me it had not been easy, not in the beginning. She said the early generations had lost far more than they had kept, entire settlements wiped out, before anyone properly understood the planet's true nature. But slowly, generation by generation, her people had learned. They had learned to read the weather before it turned violent. They had learned to recognize danger in silence, in stillness, in patterns most other species would never think twice about. They had learned that fear, left unchecked, killed just as effectively as any predator or storm, and so they had learned, painstakingly, to master it rather than be mastered by it. She said her people did not consider themselves brave, not really, because bravery implied a choice between fear and courage that most of them had simply never been given the luxury of making. Survival had never been optional where she came from. It had simply been the baseline requirement for waking up the next morning. I asked her if she missed it, despite everything she had just described. She smiled then, the same small, tired smile I had seen from her many times before, except this time there was something warmer behind it, something that told me the question had touched a part of her she rarely allowed others to see. She said yes, more than I could probably understand. She said there was a strange kind of peace in knowing exactly what the world expected of you, in understanding its rules completely, even when those rules were harsh. She said the galaxy beyond her homeworld, for all its comfort and safety, sometimes felt unpredictable in ways she found harder to navigate than anything her own planet had ever thrown at her, because comfort bred a kind of complacency she had never been raised to trust. She told me one more thing that evening, something quieter and more personal than anything she had shared before. She said her younger brother had been born during one of the harshest seasons her settlement had experienced in nearly a decade, and that her parents had spent the first several months of his life taking turns staying awake through the night, watching the settlement's early warning systems, ready to move him to shelter at the first sign of trouble. She said this was simply what it meant to raise a child where she came from, an ongoing, exhausting vigilance most other cultures would never think to associate with something as ordinary as parenthood. She told me her brother was still there, back home, older now, learning the same lessons she had learned at his age, memorizing the same warning signs, practicing the same careful, deliberate calm that had kept their family alive for generations. She said she thought about him often, especially during moments here at the academy, when the artificial comfort around her felt almost unsettling in its emptiness, in the sheer absence of anything requiring constant vigilance. I told her, honestly, that everything she had just described sounded terrifying beyond anything I could properly imagine. She laughed then, a genuine, warm sound I had rarely heard from her before, and told me that most people reacted exactly that way when she finally opened up about home. She said she understood why, and did not blame anyone for feeling that way, because her homeworld truly was as dangerous as it sounded. But she also told me something else, something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended that evening, something I have thought about many times since. She said the galaxy had spent generations quietly underestimating humanity, filing them away as an unremarkable species, soft and short-lived, useful mainly for research and endurance testing, but rarely considered a serious presence beyond that narrow role. She said very few people outside her own kind ever stopped to ask why humans, despite appearing so ordinary on the surface, so consistently seemed to handle crisis and danger with a calm that species far stronger and more naturally equipped somehow struggled to match. She said the answer, at least for her own people, was simple. They had not been raised on an easy world. They had been raised on one that demanded everything from them, every single day, without exception, without mercy, without the comfort of assuming tomorrow would look anything like today. And so when the galaxy's version of danger arrived, storms and predators and crumbling terrain, carefully calibrated to test the limits of far stronger species, it simply did not register the same way for her. It registered as familiar, it registered as manageable. It registered, more than anything else, as home. News of the reclassification review eventually reached the wider student body months later, filtering down through official channels in careful, measured language that stripped away most of the true weight behind it. Grace's homeworld had been formally reassessed, its hazard classification updated to reflect data that had apparently gone unreviewed for far too long. Quiet conversations began circulating throughout the academy, among instructors and administrators alike, about whether humanity's overall threat classification within the wider galactic community deserved similar reconsideration. Grace remained largely unaffected by any of it, at least outwardly. She continued attending her lectures, continued taking notes by hand, continued answering questions with the same short, careful precision she always had. When classmates occasionally approached her with newfound curiosity or admiration, following the Kesserin incident, she remained polite but modest, deflecting most attention back toward her coursework and upcoming examinations. I asked her once, near the end of that term, whether she found the sudden shift in how people treated her strange or uncomfortable. She told me it felt somewhat strange, yes, though not entirely unwelcome. She said what mattered most to her, more than any newfound recognition or respect, was simply passing her examinations and eventually returning home for the holiday break, back to a place none of us, for all our strength and advantages, could have survived even a single day without her guidance. I remember watching her walk away that afternoon, calm and unhurried as always, disappearing into the crowd of students moving between lecture halls, indistinguishable on the surface from any other cadet at the academy. But I knew better now. We all did. She was not simply a student who happened to be unusually capable. She was something the galaxy had never properly understood, a product of a world so unforgiving that survival itself had become an art form passed down through countless generations, refined and perfected long before she was ever born. The Academy had spent years teaching danger as a subject to be studied, a concept to be simulated and carefully controlled within the safety of engineered domes and monitored exercises. For Grace Sutton, and for the people she came from, danger had never been a subject at all. It had simply been life, lived quietly, patiently, and with a calm the rest of us are still learning to understand. And somewhere out among the stars, on a small, unforgiving world most of the galaxy still knew almost nothing about, an entire species like her continued living exactly that way, unnoticed, unassuming, and utterly, quietly unstoppable.